Good evening. My name is Melissa Roy, and I am the college's Chief Diversity Officer. On behalf of the Offices of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and the Departments of Criminal Justice and Legal Studies, welcome to What Have We Learned from the R. Kelly Sex Trafficking Trial. R. Kelly physically, sexually, and psychologically abused young women, girls, and boys from across the country from the mid-1990s until his arrest in 2019. During the same time, Grammy-winning, multi-platinum selling R. Kelly became one of the most successful singers, songwriters, and producers in the history of R&B. Although first accused more than 2 decades ago, he evaded punishment for years despite additional victims breaking their silence. Their stories received widespread exposure with the Surviving R. Kelly docuseries in 2019. The series explored how R. Kelly and his entourage of supporters protected him and silenced his victims over 3 decades. 3 weeks ago in federal court, R. Kelly was convicted by a jury of 1 count of racketeering and 8 counts of violating an interstate anti-sex trafficking law known as the Mann Act. The racketeering count places him at the head of an enterprise that used his fame to lure people into becoming potential victims. R. Kelly also faces charges in at least 2 other states, including federal child pornography and obstruction counts in Chicago. So what have we learned from the R. Kelly sex trafficking trial? We've assembled a panel of experts to dive into that question. They'll begin by answering a few questions about the basics so that we all understand the nuts and bolts. They'll next answer questions that cover factors that may have affected the verdict. And they'll finish by answering questions about equity. Before we continue, I will remind you to please remain muted until asked to speak. Feel free to ask questions using the chat functions at any time, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions later in the program. We are recording today's program and we'll post it on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website. Now let me introduce tonight's panelists. Mary B. Murphy is a retired detective lieutenant from the Rockland County District Attorney's Office. Her last assignment was director of the Spirit of Rockland Special Victims Center, where she investigated and assisted in the prosecution of sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence, elder abuse, and human trafficking cases. Natalie Surin is the Assistant Director of Education and Social Change at the Center for Safety and Change. The Center for Safety and Change is a nonprofit in Rockland County that has been around for a little over 40 years that works with victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and all other crimes. Candice A. Whatley, Esquire, is the Deputy Director of the Children's Rights Division at the Legal Aid Society of Rockland County. She has represented children in family court proceedings for more than 10 years. Jennifer Williams has been a probation officer with the County of Rockland for the past 24 years. For 14 years, she ran the Sex Offender Services Unit. Panelists, thank you for joining us today to examine what we've learned from the R. Kelly sex trafficking trial about equity and criminal justice in America. Professor Patricia Szobonya is an associate professor and the program director of criminal justice and legal studies. We will be sharing moderating duties tonight. So let's get started with the basics. I'll start with you, Candice. Instead of being charged with rape or sexual assault, R. Kelly was charged with and convicted of sex trafficking and racketeering. Why did the prosecution pursue this strategy?
Hey, thank you. So a prosecution strategy is developed based on evidence that is gathered. Once allegations are made by a complainant, or in some cases, multiple complainants, an investigation is commenced to gather and obtain evidence. A criminal investigation may include witness interviews, interrogations, collection of physical evidence, and so on. The evidence will then inform the prosecutor's decision as to what charges to bring. And these charges or crimes are broken into elements, what we call elements or parts. And in a criminal case, the prosecution has a burden to prove each element of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. Racketeering charges really pertain to and address organized crime and a pattern of illegal activity. an elaborate scheme, if you will, of individuals organizing to carry out specific illegal activity. And the prosecution would pursue these types of charges where evidence existed to show that this sort of criminal network or enterprise was formed in order to facilitate abuse.
Okay, Natalie, could you explain what is sex trafficking?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking with the use of fraud, force, or coercion for the purpose of sexual exploitation, right? So sex trafficking, just like domestic violence, has a lot to do with power and control, right? So when we think about the R. Kelly case and think of different tactics that was used, it has a lot to do with power and control, whether physical abuse was related to it, isolation, different patterns of behaviors that was used.
Great. Thank you, Mary. The racketeering charge is dependent on R. Kelly having a criminal network or enterprise that facilitated his abuse. What culture of complicity existed to allow R. Kelly to continue to abuse young women and teenage girls and boys?
Okay, well, first of all, we have to talk about what is the culture of complicity. What is that? And basically, it's an environment in which individuals are expected to turn a blind eye or even encouraged to engage in illegal activities for the sake of some gain. Many cases, the gain, as in the R. Kelly case, was financial. These people were paid very well to do what they did. R. Kelly's not the only one. If you think about Jeffrey Epstein, right? Same type situation, again, for sexual issues. But think about Bernie Madoff. There was a culture of complicity there that had to do with financial gain. So we talk about R. Kelly, and we probably see more of these kinds of cases with sexual gain, but it's that whole idea that people turn a blind eye and act illegally for a personal gain for themselves. Now, in the R. Kelly case, you know, I think it was the trial was 6 weeks long, and many of the survivors talked about how R. Kelly's friends and staff assisted, enabled, and covered up his crimes. And that's the gist of it. They covered up his crimes. They bullied, so to speak, and threatened the victims so that they wouldn't come forward. So the complicit people support the abuse. But I also wanted to mention the idea of complacency. The people who are complacent, that really are the ones that know what's going on, maybe don't gain a lot, but do nothing about it. And I had just read the other day, there was a case in Philadelphia on a subway. A woman was raped on a subway. The whole thing was on video, so they were able to get the perpetrator. People were sitting there watching. Some people were even videotaping. This is a terrible commentary, right, on society, when people can sit back and complacently let something like that happen in front of them. So this culture, these people that worked for R. Kelly delivered these young boys, young girls, and women to him. And on a higher level, they also built almost myths. They almost built myths that would shape the information that people would receive about it, so that some of these complacent people, they believe maybe it wasn't as bad as it could be because of the myths that were created. So there's a whole level of basically dishonesty besides the criminal activity in how this culture of complacency and compliancy actually comes through.
Thank you, Mary. Jennifer, under the relevant sentencing guidelines, how much prison time could R. Kelly be sentenced to? What factors will be considered to determine the length of his sentence?
You're on mute.
My apologies. The short answer to that would be a whole lot of time. I think what probably is the most important thing to remember is that In this particular case, the conviction came about as a result of a trial as opposed to a plea bargain. And we know that when there are plea bargains in place, it's very frequently already agreed on how much time and what type of sentence will be issued at the time. I think also I was actually very glad to get this question because it ropes in another area of prosecution that many people are not all that familiar with and that we're talking a lot about in my class this semester. Specifically, he was convicted of 9 different counts. So he could, in fact, be sentenced on a consecutive level. We don't see that very often. We see a lot of concurrent sentences. This could be consecutive between the racketeering and then the Mann Act, the victim trafficking. So when I was running through these different scenarios, the very bottom line would be 10 years on the racketeering. It may be 20 years on the racketeering, but that's even before they look to the trafficking charges. But I think it's important for us to remember that something is going to occur between the conviction and the sentencing, and that is the preparation of a pre-sentence investigation. Most people are not aware of a pre-sentence investigation that is actually prepared by the probation department, where I work in a probation department, so that's why I'm so familiar with this. And I've written sex offender specific pre-sentence investigations for 14 years. I wrote them. In that pre-sentence investigation report, the victims will have a voice again in the report, and the victims will have a voice hopefully at sentencing. And the pre-sentence report will also include R. Kelly's many contacts with the criminal justice system, even though his charges didn't always result in a conviction. They will be cumulative in that report. And that's something that the judge is going to have before them when pronounces sentencing. I don't think we can doubt that the exposure of this particular case also will have an impact on the decision. I heard the Gloria Alfred, who is representing a number of the victims, talk about how in all of her years of doing this work, 40 some odd years of doing this work, she had never seen a case this egregious. And I think that the court is going to hear that loud and clear.
Thank you, everyone. That last point, that no other defendant has had so many bodies essentially attached to him, is really impactful and is really eye-opening. Really, he's done some incredible things that have harmed so many people. It's time for our first poll. We want to know, did you watch or read any of the media coverage? So we'll ask strategic marketing to launch the poll. Awesome, thank you for sharing. So it looks like by far, most people watched or read a little about the media coverage, but we do have a strong representation at roughly a quarter of the participants saying that they didn't watch or read any media coverage, which is interesting. And so let's delve in a little bit further. Thank you for sharing your opinion. Now that we've level set, which was the goal of the first round of questions, it's time to proceed to a discussion of factors that may have affected the verdict. So again, we'll start with you, Candice. R. Kelly previously settled multiple claims involving inappropriate sexual contact with minors out of court. Those settlement agreements included non-disclosure agreements that prevent victims from discussing any information included in the agreement with any non-authorized party. What impact, if any, did non-disclosure agreements have on his prosecution?
Okay, so non-disclosure agreements are basically legal agreements between parties where the parties agree that they won't share information outside of themselves. And these agreements can be standalone agreements, or they can be included in a part of another agreement. They are considered to be contracts, but they're only enforceable and binding when they meet certain requirements by law. But breaching an enforceable NDA could subject the breaching party to legal penalties. Many times, these agreements are included as a part of a settlement agreement. And whether or not the agreement is actually enforceable, a witness may be reluctant to come forward if they've signed such an agreement. And if a witness is unwilling to testify, that presents an issue for the prosecution, an obstacle for the prosecution to prove its case. So with respect to this case, the R. Kelly case, it's been reported that multiple witnesses had previously entered into non-disclosure agreements. And those non-disclosure agreements were subsequently overturned, which would mean the witnesses would be free to disclose. And that is why it's so important for parties to seek the advice of an attorney before signing these types of agreements and or after an agreement is signed if they feel it's necessary to disclose information. Specifically in New York, legislation has been enacted recently in the past couple of years to afford greater protection for victims who are considering entering into these agreements in discrimination claims that would prevent complainants from disclosing the underlying facts and circumstances of harassment. And so the law generally bans such non-disclosure agreements unless the complainant prefers to have this type of agreement. And the law also spells out the process and the timeframes for entering into non-disclosure agreements in an effort to afford greater protections to complainants. So it's great that the legislature is taking this into consideration and trying to protect victims from situations like this so that they can come forward and disclose as needed.
Thank you. Natalie, part of R. Kelly's defense was to attempt to discredit his victims by characterizing them as groupies, stalkers, opportunists, extortionists, and more. In other words, they got what they were asking for. What role does victim blaming play in the prosecution or failure to prosecute sex crimes?
Yes. So victim blaming plays a big role in this whole situation because we have, for so long, we lived in a culture that kind of normalized certain behaviors. And then we turn it and blame the victim for this type of crime that is done to them by simply saying things like they were asking for it, right? Victims or survivors are often blamed for being provocative, seductive, right? Or simply asking for it, right? So victim blaming plays a big role into it. Not only that society is blaming the victim, but also internally, the victim is blaming themselves, right? They're blaming themselves for the crime that is happening. And because you'll hear that they were groupies, or because you hear that, you know, they were in love or infatuated by R. Kelly, it's almost as if that was the go-to reason for this happening to them, right? Instead of thinking it and turning it that, no, they were trafficked, right? He groomed them into doing something like this, right? He was a perpetrator. I remember watching interviews where they would say, like in the documentary, it would say he would go to schools to recruit these girls, right? He would go to the mall. And then years later, I saw an interview from MTV where they're following him in the mall. He's like, well, we're just simply at the mall having a good time. But he was using that opportunity, his power, right, to recruit these girls, right? So victim blaming plays a big role into it, because when we think of someone stepping up and coming forward for these things, right, we don't allow the platform for a victim or survivor to speak up, right? So.
Thank you.
Mary, will turn to you. Many of R. Kelly's accusers were minors at the time of his crimes. What challenges exist in cases involving minors?
Well, there's a couple of issues here that we can talk about when we talk about minors. But before we even get to that, we actually have to look at the crimes that were committed here. And I think an easy way to kind of parcel it out is, if you ever had your car stolen or your house burglarized, you know, it's a terrible thing. You're going to have some trauma, you're going to be upset, but you're probably going to get over it. When you talk about crimes of a sexual nature, it's a whole different realm of trauma and recovery. So that's what we're talking about with these R. Kelly victims, adults or minors. But when we talk about the minors in particular, you know, the law, you know, we've finally gotten it. You know, probably in the last 20 years, the Supreme Court has made numerous rulings having to do with juveniles who offend, based on the fact that we're learning that the human brain doesn't really fully develop until age 25. So the Supreme Court is obviously looking at the way the system deals with juveniles as offenders, but what about juveniles as victims? It's the same brain that's not fully developed, right? So it causes a lot of, it causes a need for specialized units, and we're trying to keep up with it, at least from a law enforcement perspective. We need specialized units where there's specialized detectives that deal with these victims, that know how to talk to them, that can do an interview in a way that's not leading or suggestive. Because remember, you know, these, as in the case of R. Kelly, all this goes before the judge. And the interviews have to be clean and precise, nothing leading, nothing suggestive. So it's a big issue, which has caused most police departments to have all these specialized units, specialized prosecutors that just do these kinds of cases. So that's a good thing that we have that. The other thing is, when you have these kinds of cases, the abuser and the victim do in fact develop a relationship. Now, it's obviously a very unhealthy relationship, but it's a relationship nonetheless. And many of these victims, especially the younger ones, may feel that they were in love with R. Kelly, or many of them would look to him to give them gifts, maybe drugs, maybe alcohol. So there's a whole psychological relationship that these victims have with R. Kelly, which really just makes it all the more difficult to be able to prosecute him with these victims in many cases probably not wanting to come forward. The only good thing is that when it comes to minors, the law is very clear. Minors cannot consent to these activities. It becomes more complicated when R. Kelly trafficked adults. A little bit more complicated because adults do have the ability to consent. Minors don't. So that kind of sets that up to be a little bit more positive. But again, that whole grooming, that whole seduction, that whole relationship issue can be very, very difficult when you're dealing even more so with minors.
Jennifer. R. Kelly forced his accusers to disclose personal information about themselves and their families, and to write letters denying that he abused them. What impact did this information, known as collateral, have on an accuser's ability to get away from the abuser and an accuser's willingness to report the abuse?
So it's interesting because so much of what Natalie and Mary said actually applies to my question. In terms of, we see the victims taking on so much of the blame and responsibility for the behavior of the abuser. And this spans not just the sexual offending area, but the domestic violence area as well. And my thought would be, we know that we have cases where there are stranger assaults, similar to what R. Kelly did to his victims. You picture a stranger assault, which we know are very rare. That individual may not want to come forward when their story would be, I was walking down the street, grabbed from behind and sexually assaulted. They may not want to come forward. So can you imagine what it is like for a victim who has something over their head, where he is holding something against them, how much more difficult it becomes? The other part of it is, when I was reading about the case and they talked about the fact that when the police were able to get in to his safe, to R. Kelly's safe, they had a search warrant. That's where they found these statements. R. Kelly had the victims write this information out prior to even being prosecuted. One would hope that that would be transparent to the jury. completely transparent. Who could think to have them write this if they weren't in fact worried, or that we would be able to tell that there was coercion here? But this whole issue regarding their ability to get away from the abuser and the willingness to report it comes back to, over and over again, we leave the victim responsible for what somebody else did to them. It's at the heart of the sex offending, the domestic violence area as well.
Thank you.
Thank you all again for answering questions in the second round. It's time for our second poll. We want to know, do you think the jury verdict in the R. Kelly trial is the correct verdict? Okay, with a resounding number of people indicating that they agree that he is guilty and therefore the verdict was correct. 80% of our respondents answered that way, but with 20% indicating that they're not sure. So as we continue to discuss these issues, hopefully you'll gain some more clarity, but there will be an opportunity, as we noted earlier, for questions that hopefully will also make you a little bit more comfortable with this. So thank you again for sharing your opinions. We've heard about some of the factors that the jury may have considered in reaching their verdict. Now it's time to discuss the verdict through an equity lens. The term equity refers to fairness and justice and is distinguished from equality. Whereas equality means providing the same to all, equity means recognizing that we do not all start from the same place and must acknowledge and make adjustments for imbalances. The process is ongoing, requiring us to identify and overcome intentional and unintentional barriers arising from bias or systemic structures. So let's start again with you, Candice. The first allegations against R. Kelly were made in 1996. Why did it take 25 years for R. Kelly to receive criminal punishment? Did the race of the victims play a role in how long it took to prosecute him?
So this question really takes us back to the prosecution's assessment of its ability to prove its case and the evidence that was available at the time. And I imagine that non-disclosure agreements and settlements played a role in witnesses' willingness to cooperate in any prosecution. And there are so many societal factors that play a role in the criminal justice system. Race is certainly one of those factors. Experts have opined that the race of the victims who were women of color played a part because of this notion that women of color are often perceived to be less believable. Certainly, the social status of the defendant tends to play a role, especially when the defendant is a public figure. Implicit bias, systemic racism, these are all factors that come into play. And that is why I would say it's so important for each of us to address these issues, because they really do infiltrate every aspect of life and often in unintended ways.
Thank you. Natalie, what impact did #MeToo, the Surviving R. Kelly documentaries series, and the #MuteRKelly have on the prosecution and the conviction of R. Kelly?
I think that the Me Too movement, as well as the Surviving R. Kelly documentary, was a major impact when we talk about, bringing awareness of what is happening. Because like someone mentioned before, this has been happening since 96? So almost 30 years ago, right? And unfortunately, the community, the Black community, knew that something was happening, right? But no one believed them because, unfortunately, women of color, we know that women of color experience a higher rate of sexual violence, right? And simply no one believed them because they're Black women, right? Black women, Black children, Black girls of color, right? Or Black and brown girls, we'll say, right? The thing is, Me Too movement kind of pushed a platform for these things to be noticed. And when I think of, I know Tarana Burke, who pushed the Me Too movement, created the Me Too movement. When she first created it by a Black woman, it was in 2006. no one really heard about the Me Too movement until 2017, when celebrities like Alyssa Milano and Taylor Swift made it popular, right? When celebrities made it popular, and again, a lot of people didn't think about it because this is something, unfortunately, people of color and Black girls, this is something that was created for them. Because I was reading that Tarana said that she wanted to find a way to connect with the Black and brown girls in the program that she ran. And one big thing that she thinks about stepping out, looking back, is often, she wondered if Black girls even knew the movement was created for them, right? It just shows you that when we talk about, when we talk about the Me Too movement, right, who are we erasing in the conversation, especially when something was created for them, right? And again, when we talk about different barriers that folks in these communities face, right, we talk about victim blaming. Black women and girls face barriers to have their experience believed and addressed, right? And this is a reality that was apparent in the long history of R. Kelly's crimes. And when we think about it again, this is something that is finally now, right, happening. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to change things up a little bit here and ask a poll question before we continue with the third round. So before we continue with our next question, we want to know whether you think you can separate the art from the artist. In other words, we want to know whether art has value, in this case, music, even though the artist has done horrible things. So, it's actually pretty close. It's a little bit more folks believe that the answer is no, you can't separate the art from the artist. By supporting an artist's work, you are supporting the artist. Thank you again for sharing your thoughts. And the question is really relevant for the next question that we have for our panelists. So Mary, R. Kelly's record label, RCA, and its parent company, Sony Music Entertainment, finally dropped him in January 2019. But his music catalog is still available and popular on streaming services such as Spotify. What is the effect of people who keep listening to his music or making jokes about the allegations?
As the poll indicated, it's a loaded question. And, everyone is entitled to their own opinion in response to that question. For me personally, I'll just share it. I'm going to put my money where my mouth is. I think he was a horrible man who committed horrible crimes against people, and I would do nothing to support him. But again, that's my position. Other people might not feel that way. But I do think that if we educate people, if people understand all that this is about, yes, R. Kelly, but other cases as well, if we educate people as to the psychological factors that go into this. This is not like robbing a bank or stealing a car. This is about basically trying to change a person who they are, trying to mold them to your satisfaction, for you to use and abuse. Very, very serious psychological stuff. Having these people be dependent on you. So I think that if people were more aware and more educated on this type of thing that we basically call human trafficking, because there's so much of it, I think maybe they might feel that they should not support him. And bad jokes, what we say, the things that we say are a reflection on us. A lot of times, everybody probably is guilty of saying a bad joke about something or another, but this is really serious. This is really, really serious stuff. So I think that if people were more aware, and I think that's one thing about the documentary. I did not see it, but I spoke to several people who did see it. And what they said was they didn't realize that he was that bad. You know, they just didn't realize it. And again, you know, it all goes back to that idea of victim blaming. Oh, you know, people didn't have to be there. They chose to engage in that behavior with him, or maybe they allowed themselves to be victimized because of financial gain or whatever. People don't always understand that whole idea of victim blaming. So again, it's a loaded question. And I just think that we need to learn more about it. And the last thing I did want to mention, when we talk about human trafficking, you know, we talk so much about sexual exploitation, which is obviously a very big part of it. But there's that other piece. There's that people who are exploited and trafficked to work for wages, for money. So it's such a very big picture that I think we just all need to be very much aware of it. And I think when people are educated as to the facts, they'll see it for really the truly horrific crime that human trafficking is in our country today.
Thank you. Jennifer, the next question. Some say the R. Kelly verdict is evidence that a cultural tide has turned after years of activism. Is the verdict a turning point?
So I actually have several answers to this. And the first one being, I don't know that the verdict is a turning point as much as the prosecution. The fact, one would think, and all that we know about what was presented at the trial, how could he not have been convicted? It's more the fact that the prosecution did not plea this down and went ahead with the prosecution. I think that's an important point. At the same time, I have some concerns that are we setting ourselves up, because this was there was a tsunami of evidence here. Are we setting ourselves up so that the next case, if it doesn't rise to the level of the R. Kelly case, there's not that much evidence? Will it not be paid attention to? That's a concern of mine. Do I think that this is, you know, is there a change, a cultural tie? I would hope so. I would hope that this has shined a light that much more on what goes on everywhere, every day. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to use an analogy. I hope that it is. It reminds me, when I was reading through this, what the O.J. Simpson case brought to the spotlight of the domestic violence. And again, if it's not a celebrity, are we going to pay attention to it the way that it was paid attention to here? I think I have more of a question. I'm leaving you with a question than I am an answer.
Thank you.
Thank you all again for sharing your thoughts about that. It's time for our fourth and final poll. We want to know what you plan to do to address the issues raised during the R. Kelly sex trafficking trial. Awesome. Thank you very much for participating. So it looks like most of you plan to educate yourself, which is, I think, the first step to making a real difference. And we still have quite a few people at more than 50% indicating that they're going to support an organization that advances racial and gender equity. And then I'll just mention the one with the next highest number of or percentage of participants who are in favor of moving forward with that is conduct consciousness raising activities about racial and gender equity issues. Thanks again so much for participating in that poll. We know that when people stand up and speak out about things that are wrong with our system can work. So thanks again for sharing your thoughts. It's time for question and answer from the audience. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat or to raise your hand if you have a question for the panelists, and Professor Szobonya will call on you.
Anybody have a question? Okay, I will start with a question. So Jennifer?
Yes.
Do you think R. Kelly could ever receive probation? And does he present a high risk to be a repeat offender?
Well, I sure would like to write his pre-sentence investigation. That's for sure. So the fact that he again, was convicted at trial as opposed to a plea deal, would reduce the likelihood of that quite a bit, because the judge has the discretion to sentence according to the final conviction, what was heard at trial. The thing to keep in mind about probation is it's an alternative to incarceration. One of the things when we would work in the sex offender, when we were writing the pre-sentence investigations and making a recommendation of what should happen, one of the key elements in a sex offender evaluation, sex offender pre-sentence investigation report is, does the individual take responsibility for their behavior? And something tells me that Mr. Kelly would not take responsibility for his behavior. I can't imagine why probation would ever be recommended. It's an alternative to incarceration. Recidivism is concerned. Do we think that there wouldn't be another victim if he were able to stay out in the community? I would think there would be. The issue regarding retaliation towards his victims if he were on probation, absolutely. So I can't imagine why anybody would ever recommend a probation sentence based on the severity of the convictions.
Thank you. All right, we do have some questions in the audience. So I will start with the first one that I can see. Benjamin?
Yes, this is just a general question to the panel, not to specifically anybody. But I don't know if it wasn't addressed, but why was it that R. Kelly was charged and put on trial more for what I'll refer to as a RICO case, in the sense that it was more about the organization of what happened and not necessarily him personally in terms of rape?
So
Anybody
I could add something to that. He was charged federally. Those were federal crimes. And I will say this, that the federal system, first of all, has the jurisdiction of the country, whereas if he were charged in individual jurisdictions, if it happened in New York City, if it happened a weekend in Los Angeles, that becomes cumbersome. Not that it can't be done, but it's cumbersome. And I don't, pretend to know why it did in fact happen this way. I'm just surmising. And the other thing being that I will tell you that the federal statutes are in many cases stricter than the state statutes. You don't want the federal government charging you and being found guilty and sentencing you, because it's it's a stricter punishment than if it was a state case in many cases.
May I add something?
Absolutely.
I think also the fact that they took a racketeering avenue, I'm hopeful that it was an acknowledgement that this was not about just R. Kelly's behavior, that this was about really a community of individuals who helped or propelled this to go as far as it did.
And there are, I believe in Illinois, there are pending charges against R. Kelly, but also some of his entourage that were helping him with this. So that's another piece of it.
Okay.
Now, I'll just mention that statute of limitations comes into play, and that some of the crimes may have already run their statute of limitations, and this criminal charge would have allowed, the federal charge would have allowed them to come at it from a different perspective. Sorry, Patricia, please.
That's okay. I was going to add that with the individual victims, it's a little bit more difficult anyway with all of the evidence around. One, the parents often didn't come forward or said that their child was not in the video. So the evidence was a little bit more difficult to that end.
Can I add something as well?
Sure.
So when I was watching the documentary, it was saying how people had first noticed R. Kelly having sex with Aaliyah when she was 13 years old, right? And at the age of 15, he married her, where she used a fake ID or, to show that she was a little bit older, because they had suspicion that she may have been pregnant, right? So in that case, he ended up marrying her because they knew that, If she was pregnant, right, that would definitely be statutory rape. And if she was pregnant, or if she was married to him where she lied in that case that she was pregnant, it wouldn't be seen as statutory rape. So when we think about it, when I was, watching it, and I thought that was really interesting, because when you think about it, oh, he really loved her, or like people were saying things like that. It's like, no, he did that to, play safe, because
Right.
at the end of the day, he knew he was doing something wrong. He was 27 at the time.
It said that if she was pregnant, that and single, she would have needed her parents to give permission to terminate the pregnancy also. So if she did get married, then she didn't need her parents' permission.
Exactly.
Okay, Zahava?
I had more of a comment, and I'll see if I can put my thoughts into words. When you say that women of color are disproportionately affected, it really is true. And I think one very concerning thing is that often when there are offenders that are a member of a minority community, and this is in every minority community, people are sometimes eager to not make themselves look bad. So they'll try to hush up the victim. And also, another thing that was mentioned is, the celebrity status of the perpetrator mattered a lot. And another huge problem is that people, don't really care about things that they don't consider personally relevant to them. And this happens. I think that's another thing that disproportionately affects members of minority communities.
Thank you. In the order that I'm reading the questions, I'm going to go to Brucey Rosenfeld. So I'll read it since it's in the chat. Is it surprising that he opted for a trial as opposed to a plea deal? And why do you think he did? And I'll leave that for anyone to answer that, because I don't think it was up to R. Kelly.
I think he got some pretty bad legal advice. I think it just goes to show how untouchable he thought he was, that he could use his stardom to sway the jury. It's understandable why it wasn't a bench trial, because certainly I think the risk would be greater that a judge would see directly what the behavior was. But I think it speaks volumes to where his head was at, that he was untouchable.
And if I could just add, there's 12 people on that jury. Only one of them would have had to say that R. Kelly was not guilty. And that would have been then a mistrial, and the prosecution could either let the case go or choose to do it again. So, I mean, I agree with Jen. I think it was his ego, was he thought he would just dazzle everybody. But I also think, to get 12 people to agree, especially with a celebrity like him, that might have been part of the reason.
I feel like that,
Sorry.
I feel like that in and of itself, like that he thought he's so untouchable, just proves how dangerous of a person he is, like his psychological, like his psyche, like he's so untouchable, egotistical.
Thank you. Dr. Barrett, you have your hand up?
I do. I want to make a comment and then a question. And the comment is, obviously this is an important discussion, and it's really great to have experts in the field. A lot of times we don't get the expert opinion, and all of you have worked in this field. And so the answers are so on point, it's not funny. And then the other point I want to make is that, this is a national trial and it's attracted a lot of media. And I've spoken with Natalie before and other women from the Center for Safety and Change, and of course, Mary and Jennifer, who I know. Human trafficking is a big deal in Rockland County. And the first time I heard that, it was shocking. And I'd like to see you guys speak to that, to what is the level of human trafficking and what is done about it in the prosecution area.
I would just like to share, at probation, we had an individual who was actually on probation for an unrelated offense. And this individual, I was contacted by the number of local police departments regarding this individual because they knew for absolute certainty that he was sexually trafficking women in two particular areas of Rockland County. And it was rather disturbing to me how untouchable he was. And interestingly, because he was so good at getting his victims to believe that he wanted nothing but the best for them. And in the end, it reminded me a little bit about Al Capone finally went to prison for what? Tax evasion or mail fraud. He finally went to prison on a DWI related charge. And the individual is back out again, and I constantly am looking at the name, and I know how frustrated it was for a number of departments in Rockland County to be able to prosecute him. So absolutely, as Kevin Barrett said, it's going on right in our backyard.
And I'll just jump in and say, so I think one of the important things, from our perspective is raising awareness with our clients to make sure that they know the supports that are available, that they recognize what human trafficking is. They know who they can look to for help and support. I think that's so important, is really just raising that awareness. And this came up during the panel questions. Brain development for children is so important because they don't necessarily recognize when these things are happening, and that's what makes these crimes so outrageous and so heinous. So prevention is very important in talking to kids about what to look out for and things to avoid, and when they should seek help from an adult in the situation is very important as well.
Thank you. I see Jordan, you have your hand up.
Can I add something as well?
Sure.
So right before that, also traffickers are good manipulators, right? They do a really good job of grooming the survivor, right? Where they're targeting that victim, they're gaining that trust and information from them, right? And then feeling the need, whether they're selling them this dream, whether they're giving them support. A lot of times it's happening to at-risk youths, right? So being that support system, gaining that trust for them, that's all part of their grooming stages, right? And then we'll see the signs of the isolation and abuse. So they're doing that to, at the end of the day, maintain that power and control, right? Traffickers are good manipulators, just like abusers. So when we think of this, why is this happening? How is this happening, right? They do a really good job. They know what they're doing. They're doing a really good job grooming that survivor, that victim.
Thank you. Jordan?
Hello, everyone's doing well. So the comment I want to say is, I feel like when I did my research on like human trafficking and all that, and doing a lot of watching like law episodes, I kind of see like they come off as like a leader, someone that is like a lookup person and try to see like persuade people like a salesman. Like they try to get the person in and bring them in and try to feel like I'm there for you and all that, and then they try to like manipulate you and then play you as a game. And the question is, like one of the cases that I looked at R. Kelly, was there like two boys that I heard there was two boys that he kind of like groomed in a way? Instead it was, I thought it was mostly girls, but I found there was two boys. Were there two boys in the case?
I did see the documentary and they did mention one boy. I saw one.
That's a perfect example of when we were talking about victims coming forward when he has material on them. My understanding was that he videotaped one of these males engaged in a sexual act with an underage person, so he had that to hang over his head.
Also the promise of a music career.
And if I could add, for all the amount of victims that came forward, and I give them a lot of credit, and testified at his trial, there are many more that we'll never hear about. Some of which never told anybody about what happened.
Jordan, you still have your hand up?
My bad. Does it always happen? Because I always see it like mostly like sex, like more like the culture. Like when I listen to like the minor stuff, does it always happen like in culture, media, like entertainment before like rock and roll? Because I heard a lot of rock and roll musicians like Elvis, Beatles music, like they like explained in a document about like 17-year-old girls, they be singing music and all that. Like, did it happen like before like rock and roll and all that stuff?
Well, I think Elvis married Priscilla when she was 15. So
They
she
did
was,
actually have that on the
Right?
documentary.
she was underage.
I see a question in the chat. It says, how early should we start teaching our children about this? For example, good, appropriate touching, bad, inappropriate touching. Is there an age appropriate material available?
I can answer that question. But before that, this has been happening for so long, right? And like Mary Murphy mentioned that Elvis, right? Elvis married Priscilla when she was probably 13, maybe. We have lived in a culture for so long where something like this was normalized, right? Where we would see situations where it's okay in certain situations like this, right? Not thinking that consent is a big factor. So the question was, how young should we start teaching people something like consent, healthy touch, what is okay and what's not okay? And I think at a young age, we should be teaching children about consent and the conditions of consent and what is okay and what is not okay. I feel like we grow up even like, letting people know that yes means yes, and kind of like listening out for that yes, right? Getting people's consent and things like that.
I just have to add one thing to that. Having interviewed probably hundreds of children under the age of 5 or 6 that have been sexually abused, I will say this. I think that as soon as a child is able to talk and understand you, you just very simply start with explaining to them that their body is their very own and no one should be touching it unless maybe you're sick and you have to go to the doctor. You can very gently, non-threateningly talk to children. And I agree with Natalie about the consent issue, but the 4-year-olds don't know anything about consent, but you can teach them that their body is their very own and no one, not even mommy or daddy, is allowed to touch it unless maybe you're sick or mommy or daddy has to do something to help you get better. Very non-threatening. Teach your children.
Yeah, the Center for Safety and Change actually goes into these schools and teach about, teen dating violence, sexual assault, consent, and gender stereotypes, as well as bystander intervention, right? What can we do? We're in the middle schools and the high schools and the colleges here in Rockland, but also one of the biggest things that we are trying to do is get into the elementary schools, because we know that it's important to have these conversations and start these conversations at a young age, right? And like what Mary Murphy was telling you, teaching kids that yes, this is okay, no, this is not okay, and even if it's mommy and daddy, right?
Just to point out some comments in the chat from Board of Trustee Mary Lou Dillon. It can be your colleague who works right next to you every day, so it doesn't even have to be this big mega star that acts this way. And another comment from Monica Jackson, there are several age-appropriate books on good touch, bad touch. Google them. So there are some materials out there. Anybody else have any more questions? We do have another question. Do you think the parents of the victims should be at blame? or charged maybe. So I did not watch the documentary, but I remember hearing of parents sending their child to R. Kelly's house alone. I just thought it was very odd. It's a good question.
I'm wondering who can get this first, Mary, you or me? Go ahead.
Yeah, right? Go ahead, Jen.
Well, I'll be very quick, and Mary's got much more but I saw that in the chat and I was hoping it would be read, because I hope we can go back to this one saying that it is one of my all-time favorite sayings, which is, we need to stop teaching our daughters, our sisters, our females how to not get raped. We need to start teaching our sons, our husbands, to not rape. We need to not divert from who committed these acts. R. Kelly committed these acts. As soon as we start talking, and I am, if we can say, guilty of it, where I'll say, well, where were the parents? What was going? But the bottom line to this is, this just goes to show you how well this type of, how skilled they are at this type of behavior. We know from, Mary and I were down at the Crimes Against Children conference in Dallas, where the prosecutors for the Larry Nassar case spoke about the fact that the parents were in the room when the children were being sexually abused. So it's an open-ended question in terms of where the parents' responsibility.
Yeah, I agree with Jen. Let's put the blame on R. Kelly, because that's where the blame belongs. As far as parents go, parents, watch your kids. Don't let the gymnast tell you that your kid's the best in the class, so I'm taking your kid upstairs to the special room where I have special equipment. That happened to a case in Rockland County. Watch your kids. If you can't be there, then it's not worth being done. Don't leave anybody with your kids.
I did see another question. I think I saw it twice. So let me just find that. It was a question: why are cases like sexual assault harder to prove than other crimes, especially when there's no physical evidence?
Well, that's one reason right there. There's no physical evidence. When your car's stolen, your car is physical evidence. When your house is burglarized, sometimes there's a point of entry, a broken window, a broken door. So the first thing is there is no physical evidence. But again, these cases are so much deeper because of the psychological impact that these cases have on people. And when it's a stranger, that's one psychological impact. But imagine when someone is raped by someone they know, that's another whole psychological impact. So these are all the things that make these cases particularly difficult to prove. I can say, at least for Rockland County, and Jen will agree, it's not for lack of trying. But again, we have to be able to convince a jury of 12 people. They're not easy cases. And they're the kinds of cases where there's usually not a witness. Okay, usually no one saw what happened. It's just the two people that were there.
And I'll just talk about, for victims, how difficult it is because of the psychological trauma to talk about this. It's testimony is difficult. You're asked a lot of questions about something that has completely traumatized you. People have physical reactions to having to talk about the trauma that they sustained. And sometimes they're just really not able to do it. And if they're not able to testify, then the prosecution can't prove their case and the case can't go forward. So psychological trauma is a huge impediment to being able to prosecute these cases.
Yep. I think we have time for one more question. So, do you think we should live a life with constant fear? And what are some precautions we should take on a daily basis?
I don't believe in living a life of fear, but I think we should always be aware and educate ourselves about the dangers that are out there. The more that we're educated, the more we can protect ourselves and others who are around us.
Anyone else want to add to that? I'll just end on, I agree. I think that awareness is key in educating ourselves, being aware.
So thank you
Okay.
everyone for those awesome questions and the equally wonderful responses from our panelists. I want to wrap up with a quote from Dr. Candice Norcott, who is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Chicago School of Medicine. Dr. Norcott speaks internationally on issues related to trauma, gender, and race. She was featured on both seasons of Surviving R. Kelly and was a guest on Jada Pinkett Smith's Red Table Talk as an expert discussing the impact of sexual abuse on girls and young women and the intersection of race and this phenomenon. She said, "What I hope comes out of this is more messages about accountability and fewer messages about doubt, shame, and the persecution of survivors who decide to come forward." I echo her sentiments. I hope we have given you some things to think about when you think about the R. Kelly sex trafficking trial and what, if any, lessons may have been learned. Thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. And I'll repeat, thank you for the great questions. Thank you to the panelists for sharing their thoughts with us. Thank you to Strategic Marketing for facilitating this Zoom experience. I hope you will join us, though, for some upcoming events that we have. International Pronouns Day is on this coming Wednesday, and we will have a fantastic and engaging conversation with Joe Falco from Student Success. And we have some other programming coming up as well, so just keep an eye out. Have a great evening, and thank you for joining us.